Hello, welcome, Cabbage here. I just finished translating the Nier Chronology in the back of the Reincarnation Materials book, so let's take the chance to talk about translation and localization. Just to warn people up front, there will be no graphics on screen, so you can treat this like a radio show or a podcast. It's just about language anyway, so it's appropriate. But I've wanted to make this video ever since doing the dramatic recital translations for Nier Reincarnation. I just never got around to it until now. But also, translation and localization has had some controversy surrounding it lately. We can talk about those indirectly. I'll just bring up what I find acceptable and unacceptable when taking Japanese to English, and touch on those controversies as we come across them. First of all, with translation there's one non-negotiable aspect. Meaning must be preserved, and everything else is secondary. The purpose of language is to convey meaning, and if meaning is not getting across, there's no point to the translator's work, so we would all be better off if they hadn't done it in the first place. George Orwell wrote a good essay talking about this. I want to make a video about that too, someday soon. So meaning is objectively the most important thing, but there is an aspect that is subjectively the most important thing to me. Preserving the experience of the narrative. I'll explain what I mean by this. In the writer's view, all aspects of the narrative are there to advance the narrative, and make it memorable, or moving, or exciting, or whatever. Anything that gets in the way of the reader's or viewer's enjoyment of the narrative must be avoided or sacrificed, and that includes clunky or misrepresentative translation. If a translation is hard to understand, or too wordy, or breaks the flow of the story, or does not harmonize with the source material somehow, attention is drawn away from the work and drawn towards the translation itself, which should not happen. I watched a decent amount of dubbed and subbed Japanimation in the early 90s, and it was rough going. Oftentimes my friends and I would be laughing at how nonsensical the English was, rather than following the story and getting invested in the characters. Apparently, in those days, localizers were often just given a list of lines to translate, not even a script with character names and who was saying what, just lines, and that's part of why they were so bad. But ideally, the translation should be invisible, totally in service to the experience of the narrative, except in rare standout cases where it can add to the experience, like in Elden Ring or Final Fantasy XII, but you need very talented people for that. So those two things, meaning and serving the experience of the narrative, are the two most important things. Two less important things, but arguably trickier, are cultural concerns and tone/characterization. One of the fun things about taking in media from other cultures is learning about those cultures, but getting culture across should not be done at the expense of meaning or the experience of the narrative, and so I personally would sacrifice cultural notes if it were just too hard to include in a way that felt natural. Like I've seen screens of fan-translated anime where they have the spoken line at the bottom and then at the top they have a cultural note to explain something a character referred to or explain something about the situation or place to give context, and I'm like, no. If it's not necessary to the enjoyment and the progression of the narrative, leave that out. It gets too much in the way of the experience. Not that I'm saying the cultural notes are not important or that people interested in that are wrong, no. I just have the point of view that the experience of the narrative is the most important thing and should be protected, and cultural notes can be sought out afterwards separately. And here I'm going to seemingly contradict myself, but if the meaning is tied too much to cultural nuance, then I say change the meaning. But again, it is in service to the experience of the narrative. An example in a work I did was a Nier Reincarnation livestream dramatic recital, where some characters make some bad jokes. The jokes translated literally would not make any sense to non-Japanese speakers, and explain why they are funny in the original Japanese would take a whole other video, so what I did was change the meaning and write new, bad jokes that would make English speakers groan, hopefully. What's important here is not the content of the bad jokes, it's the fact that bad jokes are being told, so I felt comfortable changing the meaning and changing the jokes. That was a fun little challenge for both my Japanese and English skills. But ideally, a cultural note would be cleanly taken care of in the natural flow of the conversation or narration by perhaps adding a helpful word or two. Next we come to what I feel is the most difficult thing about translation, and that is tone and characterization. And this was brought up in the recent controversies, and it is the #1 cause of me generally disliking English dubbing. However, if we start talking about voice acting, this video will go on even longer, so we'll just stick to localized text characterizations. Tone is the mood of the narrative overall, and characterization is how characters are portrayed, their personality. A narrative can have tones that are happy, or serious, or dramatic, or sad. In visual mediums like movies or video games or comic books, this is not too difficult to translate because a lot of the work is done with the setting and costumes, and movies and video games have the added aspect of music. Characterization is where the trouble lies, and a large part of characterization is language, how the characters speak. The language a character uses reflects on their personality and how we perceive them. There are aspects of the Japanese language where a parallel simply doesn't exist in English, so those aspects are either ignored or expressed in a different way. I saw one controversial localization of how a character spoke, where in the original Japanese, the character was very one way, but if the lines were to be translated literally, the same nuance would not come across in the English, so the localizer made the decision to change the meaning in order to achieve the original nuance. In this case, I thought it was the right decision to make, but with this kind of situation, the sense and the taste of the translator comes into play, and the controversy arose because in this case, the sense and the taste of the translator did not vibe with the sense and the taste of many gamers. Objectively, an honest attempt at translation, but subjectively, a failure of taste and sense. And here finally we get to the core of the problem. Good sense and good taste and good style are hard to come by even in humans, to say nothing of AI. I've read translations of Japanese novels which come across as extremely dry, and all the characters seem like robots, and it's because they were translated in the 80s or earlier by folks whose Japanese was perfectly good and accurate, but they had no sense or taste or style when it came to tone and characterization. In short, they were not writers, and that's what you need to be an excellent translator. You also have to be a good writer in the target language. The localizers of Elden Ring and Final Fantasy XII were so good because they were writers. They seemed well read, and they had good taste, and so they were able to contribute to and elevate those experiences. And for those reasons, translating the chronology was fairly easy for me because the only thing I had to worry about was meaning. No tone to worry about since it was like an encyclopedia, so I could just translate it pretty much literally, and it would end up dry and matter-of-fact, and that would be appropriate. No cultural notes to worry about either, although there were events in Japan. Japanese culture didn't figure into it, so I didn't have to worry about it. Also, since I was translating text and not a movie, I didn't have to worry about length or time constraints, which is an issue with, say, the dramatic recitals. And finally, I didn't even have to worry about narrative flow because it wasn't a narrative in the traditional sense, it was just a list of events. And that was part of why I did the chronology first. Although it was labor-intensive, it didn't take much subjective interpretation, so I knew I could do it faster and more easily. The Recollections of Dusk stories may be easier in one sense, because they will probably have fewer technical terms and difficult kanji than the chronology, but they will definitely be more difficult overall, because I'll have to parse the tone and characterizations and attempt to get that across faithfully and smoothly in the English. I could of course ignore the nuances and put out a transliteral localization powered by AI, and probably no one would complain about that, but I have too much pride in myself as a translator. I feel I have good taste as a translator, so I want to exercise it here, even if it means it's going to take me longer to do the job. I do have some experience with doing this in the livestream dramatic recitals by the voice actors, but I was assisted with characterizations by the performances both in voice and facial expressions of the actors. These RD stories will be my first all-text attempts at narratives, if I remember right. It should be an interesting time. Thankfully, we have previous experience with these characters, so I can build off of the established characterizations. I hope I get them accurately. I always say this, but you could give one line to 10 translators and get back 10 different translations, and that's why I'm not too worried about rushing out my translations of the RD stories. Even if someone else releases their translation earlier, there will be differences in their style and my style, perhaps differing levels of success in the tone and characterizations, and you, the reader, can pick which you like. It's why new translations of, say, The Tale of Genji keep coming out. It's all about the translator's style and the preference of the reader. But yes, those are my thoughts on translation and localization, and I look forward to the challenge of the RD stories in Nier Reincarnation. I hope I can do them justice. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again. Take care.